Hello again, everybody. This is Rusty, aka William Robinson, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. And this is my podcast, and we're glad you're here this week. Well, in Orange Beach here this week, the heat's been hot and the ground's been dry, to quote an old song. And, if you know what that song was, you can put it in the comments below. This will be another contest, I guess, like we did before. At any rate, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button, share, subscribe, make comments, all of those things, and we'll get on with it. As we move on to the calendar, I just wanted to remind everybody that we've had several big and some sad events this week, and I'm going to direct most of the podcast today to a couple of those events. One of which, on July 22nd, 2025, or 3 days ago as of this recording, Ozzy Osbourne died. What can you say about Ozzy? That he was a pioneer of heavy metal genre of music? Sure, that's true. That he could be outrageous on or off stage? Sure, that's true. He got arrested a couple of times for various things, basically things you could term as bad behavior. In 1982, he was arrested in San Antonio for public drunkenness and urinating on the Alamo, which they take very seriously in Texas. Then in 1984, in my hometown, Memphis, Tennessee, Ozzy was arrested once again on Beale Street at about midnight for public drunkenness and taken to jail. The mugshot from that arrest became famous in a way because Ozzy was wearing a St. Louis Blues hockey jersey that someone had given him earlier in the day. Now, Ozzy had no idea what the St. Louis Blues were. He didn't care anything about hockey. He just happened to be wearing it because someone gave it to him. Well, he got out, and eventually the charges were dismissed. But the irony of that is the mugshot became so popular that the St. Louis Blues heard about it, and they actually contacted Ozzy later on and asked him to be their official mascot, which Ozzy agreed to, and turned out he thoroughly enjoyed it, even though he admitted he never actually learned the rules of hockey and never watched a full game. Musically, Ozzy had a great voice, a unique voice, not just the tone, but he really had a gift for coming up with melodies that could go over specific guitar riffs. And that's not easy to do. He fit that in perfectly with his collaborator, Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath, who was their guitarist. Tony was famous for coming up with these mammoth guitar riffs, and Ozzy created melodies to go over the top of them that very few people could sing, but Ozzy could do it. Along with their bassist, who was Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, who was the drummer, they came to be Black Sabbath, which really pioneered the heavy metal genre within rock music and left an imprint on many, many artists after that. Their sound was really unique from 1970 or so to 1974. My favorite song from that time was the song Supernaut, which was from the Volume 4 album, which I still have around here somewhere. Ozzy's solo career after Black Sabbath was very successful also, although I had kind of moved on from that style by then. Ozzy was clearly gifted at collaborating with brilliant guitarists. He worked with the guitarist Randy Rhoads in his solo career, and a good example of that collaboration is the song Crazy Train from that era. Ozzy then later on reinvented himself in the 2000s on TV with a reality show called The Osbournes, which was highly entertaining, at least to me, whether you were a fan of the music or not. That show was criticized by some for kind of displaying Ozzy as a parody of himself. But I really think there was sort of a Sly Fox genius on display there, and it became perhaps the most successful reality show of that era. And then yesterday, as we're filming this, which would be July 24th, 2025, we lost Hulk Hogan. Hulk was, without question, the biggest name in pro wrestling ever. He drew more fans, drew more ratings, drew more money than anybody else. You can suggest names like Stone Cold Steve Austin or The Rock, but they really aren't close. Hulk had issues, like we all do. He used anabolic steroids. He lied about it on national television. He was married 3 times, and his divorce from his first wife was absolutely miserable and was dragged out through the courts and through the press for all the country to see. But he gave people a lot of joy all over the world. Hulk even came to Memphis back before he was famous in 1979. Look up the video introducing the Hulk in Memphis on YouTube, and you'll see an amazing video of a young Hulk Hogan posing before a backlight that was narrated by my buddy Michael St. John, who was working for the promotion at that time. As for his best matches, you have to first mention, I guess, the match with Andre the Giant at the Pontiac Silverdome before 92,000 fans in 1987. That was where he really took the torch from Andre to be the ultimate good guy, ultimate fan favorite in the wrestling world. I might also add that his match at the Bash at the Beach in 1996 was just as important. This was in Daytona Beach, and this was where he turned heel or turned bad guy. The crowd was just stunned when Hogan turned on them, and they really became highly agitated and started filling up the ring with trash and debris. There was stuff flying through the air. And Hulk just kept going, telling the crowd how stupid they were and how he didn't care for them and they had never supported him, blah, blah, blah. And that event really cemented Hulk again as the biggest name in a new era of pro wrestling and went on to earn millions more dollars after that. Hulk's death was reported to be due to heart failure, with no details given at the time of this recording. Hulk had undergone over 20 operations on his back for injuries that he'd suffered in the ring, which sadly is not uncommon for the wrestlers of that era who, didn't want to take time out of their schedule to get fixed or to rest up because if they didn't wrestle, they weren't making money. That and his longtime use of anabolic steroids probably were large factors in his death. And although I will admit to being a fan of Hulk, I was a little older when Hulkamania came along, so I didn't get into it as the kids did. I was certainly not a Hulkamaniac per se, but I am sad that we've lost someone who gave so much entertainment and so much joy to so many people, and contributed so much to our culture. R.I.P. Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, 1953 to 2025. So I remembered after I'd finished filming yesterday that I'd forgotten to include my own story about meeting Hulk Hogan a number of years ago. It was back in 1993. At the time, Hulk was filming his TV show, Thunder in Paradise. I was actually presenting a scientific paper at a meeting in Orlando at Disney World, actually. And I arrived at the hotel late one night. The flight was late or something. And when I got there, the only place left open to eat was a sushi restaurant in the hotel. So I went there, and no longer than had I sat down, then in walked Hulk Hogan, Jimmy Hart, and Brutus the Barber Beefcake. There was almost no one else in the place, as I said, so I went over and talked to him. I first talked to Jimmy Hart because he was a Memphis guy, like me, and I actually knew more about him than I did about Hulk. Well, after a few minutes, Hulk leaned over and said something like, "Well, when you're ready to talk to a star, brother, here I am," which we all got a laugh out of. It was funny. At any rate, we sat and talked to him for 15 minutes or so, and he was a great guy, lots of fun, had lots of fun stories. He was willing to answer any question. Finally, I asked him before I left, "Well, is there any chance you're going to get back into wrestling, Hulk?" And he looked at me, "Well, you never know, brother," which was my Hulk Hogan story. I could spend all day talking about Ozzy Osbourne and his music or Hulk Hogan and his wrestling, but there are hundreds of other people out there doing the same thing. So I'm actually going to move on to our healthcare segment for now. There are actually a couple of items this week that I ran across that kind of fit into our series on the healthcare system in the United States. So I thought it would be interesting to share them with you here now. The first report I noticed was on the concept of value-based care. Now, I've used the term value-based care several times in my series on healthcare that we've been doing the last few weeks here. And I had several people ask me in the comments and elsewhere over that time what that really meant. And I realized that that may not be an easy point to grasp. So I came up with an example. Let's call it a parable, like in the New Testament. Parable. That can be our word for the week, I think. Anyway, you've probably heard stories of Canadians, for example, who came to the US to get elective surgery like knee replacement or something like that, right? So, did you know that it also happens in the US? And it kind of illustrates the meaning of the phrase value based care. So, we're going to talk about that. Here's an example that I came across lately. It was just fascinating. The case itself is hypothetical, but it's made up of actual occurrences. A 58-year-old woman, female, sees her primary care doctor for chronic and acute left knee pain on a Saturday. Actually, she has the pain on a Saturday, and it's so bad that it actually forces her to the ground just out of the blue. She'd been hurting for a little while or aching off and on for weeks to months, but this sudden episode is much more painful in and of itself. So she calls her primary care doctor, who says they can see her on the following Tuesday. When she gets there, the primary care doctor orders an ultrasound and an x ray, which will be done then the following Friday. So now it's a week out. The patient also then has to pay two different facility fees because the imaging center is not in the same facility where her primary care doctor is. Anyway, the results of the imaging shows bony arthritis and a potential bone mass. She goes to see her PCP or primary care doctor the next Monday, and he looks at those results and orders an MRI and refers her to an orthopedic surgeon. Well, the wait to get a visit to the orthopedic surgeon in her network is 4 to 6 weeks. So, unless she goes out of network, in which case she would pay out of pocket, she has to wait. So, she does. So, she waits, and her knee continues to hurt. She even has another acute episode that causes her to fall to the ground because it hurts so bad. When she finally gets in to see the orthopedist, he's already kind of annoyed because he can't visualize the images that are electronically done because the systems in his office don't communicate with the systems where the images were done. He also kind of grumbles under his breath about the PCP for ordering useless tests anyway. He goes on, he examines the patient, and he figures to himself, you're not letting this on you, that this patient's going to need a new knee at some point, but his surgery schedule is booked for at least 2 months in advance. So, just to do something, he reorders some of the images that he can't get over the system and sends the patient out with some outpatient non-invasive treatments like anti-inflammatories, topical anti-inflammatory, and physical therapy. Well, during that time, her knee pain continues, and about 2 or 3 days later, after that, the orthopedic office calls her to tell her they still can't get the images from the primary care doctor and that she's going to have to call them herself if she wants us to be able to see those images. Well, she does, and that takes her 3 to 4 phone calls and 2 or 3 hours out of the time she needed for other things to get that worked out. Then, when she returns to the orthopedist in 2 months, she's told she needs a knee replacement, and she's put on the schedule for another 2 months out because he's always booked months in advance. So it turned out the bony mass was just an artifact of the filming that they didn't even find out about because they didn't get the final copies of those original images until after the surgery had already been done. It went pretty uncomplicated. She did, in fact, get a knee replacement, stayed in the hospital a day or so, went home on physical therapy, which took another couple of months. And it was pretty uncomfortable and pretty painful. And it was really, like I said, a couple of months before she really started to feel good again. So from start to finish, this whole episode took 6 to 8 months from the time she saw her first doctor to when she started to feel better. Here's a different scenario, which is actually not hypothetical because the author of this article did it and wrote about it, and I'll attach the actual reference below. She was 55 years old and also had acute and chronic knee pain. However, she was also a healthcare consultant and specialist working for a large investment group in New York. So she was very savvy about the process of healthcare. So she actually booked herself a trip to Thailand and a visit with two orthopedists there on the same day. On that day, she got two expert consultations on her knee pain. She got an MRI, and she found out that they both recommended that she did not have surgery, and that all cost a total of about $400. It went so smoothly that she went even further and got some more lab work, a cardiac stress test, a capsule colonoscopy, and some more consultations. The entire thing, including airfare and accommodations, cost her about $4,300. She did rehab for her knee back in the United States, which was covered by her insurance, and her knee felt much better in 6 to 8 weeks, or about 6 months faster with less time and less money out of pocket than her counterpart did in the first part of the story, who received all of her care in the United States. That's the definition of value based care. And that's why I encourage people to be aware of those issues and to work to change them in the US. That's really what this is all about. So, as you can see from these examples, value based care is typically not a priority in the US healthcare system, and I think it should be. So, I would encourage all of you to continue to follow the attempts that we're making now to improve on the US healthcare system. And here's another report that caught my eye this week, and this was titled Healthcare Spending by Diagnosis. So, what would you guess is the most expensive diagnosis in the US? Or let me phrase that this way. What diagnosis does the US spend more money on than any other? And I'm not talking about the cost per patient. Some people with cancer will receive hundreds of thousands of dollars of chemotherapy per year, or some children with rare genetic disorders will have lots of money you have to spend on them. Instead, what I'm referring to is overall spending on a disease. That means it has to affect a lot of people for a long time while being serious enough to generate plenty of medical bills. So there was a report recently that actually measured those things. And again, I will attach the reference down below. So, what is the most expensive diagnosis in the US? It's not the common cold. It is common, but it's also short lived. It's inexpensive to treat. So, that's not it. And don't guess something like multiple sclerosis. It is serious and it's expensive, but it's not common enough to make it onto the leaderboard. I thought about actually doing a full top 10, but that would take too long. So let's just do a top four, I think. Did you guess heart disease? That's what I guessed, actually, before I read the full paper and started researching this topic. It is a common disorder, set of disorders, really, and it involves expensive treatments like cardiac catheterization and bypass surgeries and various medicines. And it's chronic, too, even after all those expensive treatments, because it still requires lifelong medications. But I was wrong about heart disease. It clocks in at number four, actually, with only, what was it, $90 billion dollars on average in spending. And this is from the data is from 2016, which was the latest information these authors had. If you guessed diabetes, you were also wrong, but you did a little better than me. That actually came in at number three on the list with $111 billion dollars in spending. How about number two? You probably won't get this. That would be communicable diseases, which include the flu and pneumonia, sepsis, all the childhood infections, and various other things. That was number two at about $125 billion dollars of spending per year. Now, before we get to number one, I'll give you my other thought on what might have been the most expensive, and that was cancer. That was my specialty in practice, so I figured that might be extremely expensive. I know it was extremely expensive. At any rate, in this study, it was not. Turns out that the authors of this report actually broke cancer up into its separate sites. In other words, it did not roll cancer altogether. So, for example, breast cancer or colon cancer or others. And actually, of those, it turned out the most expensive by a lot was prostate cancer. And that's largely because there are more cases of prostate cancer in the U.S. than there are of any other cancer. Now, you ready for number one? Did you guess? No? The number one most expensive diagnosis in U.S. healthcare spending is back pain. That's right. They actually include neck pain along with back pain. And it's an interesting thought. You know, back and neck pain sometimes lead to expensive treatments like surgery, but not all that many. Most people, however, with back and neck pain will receive multiple x rays, multiple MRIs. Even when those tests are not particularly helpful, they will receive pain medications, neuropathy medications, physical therapy, trips to chiropractors. Many of them will miss work when they're experiencing a pain exacerbation. In addition, many do receive surgery, and about half of those surgeries provide little or no actual pain relief. And back pain and neck pain are kind of like a parasite. They hurt you, they may debilitate you, perhaps, but they don't kill you. You're likely to live a long time with back pain. So, back and neck pain typically affect people in what should be the happiest and most productive years of their lives. So, not a surprise that it would be the most expensive when you look at it in that light. And that makes you wonder about our government's medical spending priorities. Now, this may seem like heresy coming from me, and certainly a number of my colleagues in oncology will feel that way. The NCI, or National Cancer Institute, gets about $7 billion annually in funding to do research on cancer. By contrast, the NIAMS, and that's the National Institute for Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Disease, gets about 685 million. So that's about a tenth of the budget of the NCI. Is that appropriate? Is that efficient? Give it some thought. And we'll continue this series on healthcare costs in the U.S. on an intermittent basis. So, moving on, this next segment in the podcast each week typically is regards something fun or silly or quirky or something like that. But I thought about it and I realized this is kind of a somber week for both music and wrestling and culture in general. So I don't think it's really appropriate to add anything else, like from the music world or any of my other peculiarities, I guess. Anyway, so that's about all I had this week. Ozzy and particularly Hulk's death really struck home with me. I'm praying for their family and friends. I hope you will also. And then finally, as I say each week, please watch next week's podcast. Okay? See you later.